Hi everyone, welcome. I am Jillian Hermansky with World Learning. We also have my colleagues here, Vlad, Lakin, Nicole, and Aaron, probably a few others from the Global Networks team as well. Many of you know us from professional exchange programs. For everyone else, thank you for joining. We appreciate your participation in our alumni engagement events. Due to limitations for exchange programs at the moment because of COVID-19, we are hosting webinars to allow us to continue engaging with our alumni networks and connect us to discuss those important topics and issues that we are facing in the world today. These webinars are produced by World Learning in collaboration with the Digital Communication Network. For today's theme, we are focusing on the environment and climate change in the context of the global pandemic. Our speakers have a diverse set of backgrounds, so the topic will be presented from a variety of perspectives. For today's session, we are using Zoom as the main platform, but live streaming to Facebook. We ask that everyone keeps their mics muted unless you are the one presenting. Speakers will each have an opportunity to present, and then we will open up the floor to questions and have a more interactive experience. You can share your questions within the chat feature for whichever platform you are streaming the webinar. My colleagues and I will track your questions and raise your inquiries following the presentations. So again, welcome and thank you for joining us for this event to discuss the implications of COVID-19 on the environment and climate change. We will begin with our first speaker, Professor Christopher Niddle. Christopher is the George B. Schultz Professor of Applied Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the Director of MIT's Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. For his presentation, Christopher will discuss COVID-19 short and long-term effects on renewables and climate change. Christopher, you now can begin your presentation.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you for having me, and I hope everyone around the world is as safe as possible during these trying times. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some recent work that I've done with some colleagues that looks at the short and long run effects of the pandemic on greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll admit from the onset that this is very US centric. So we're focusing on US emissions, but the techniques that we use here could certainly be used for other parts of the world. So what I'm going to be talking about is based on a paper that was recently published in the journal called Joule. It's available online if you'd like to download the entire text. I'll give a shout out to my co-authors, Ken Gillingham, Martin Auvert from Yale, Jing Li is my colleague at the Sloan School, and Mar Regwent is at Northwestern. So what we do in this fairly short paper and fairly accessible to non-academic economists is look at the short run effects of the pandemic on US greenhouse gas emissions and also on particulate emissions or local pollution emissions. That's the easy part. I think we can use very simple econometric methods that really, what I would say, nail the answer to that question. But we also want to know about the long run impacts of the pandemic. And that's the tougher part because a lot of assumptions that go into that, many of which we really have no idea of what assumption to make. So what we're going to do for the long run effects is do some sophisticated back of the envelope calculations. And the way we're going to do that is by asking the question, how easy is it for the long run impacts, which there's many reasons to believe the long run impacts are to put upward pressure on US greenhouse gas emissions. How easy is it for those long run impacts to outweigh the short run impacts that we estimate? And I'll give you the answer to that in a second. For the short run, what we're going to do is use data from the electricity industry, and the gasoline industry to understand how, when the pandemic began, how the demand for electricity, natural gas for heating, and gasoline for driving was impacted by the pandemic. And that I'll be able to show you some nice graphs, and you could clearly see it in the data of what direction it was going. The reason why the long run is tougher to think about is that there's a lot of different reasons why this may change things in the long run. So I've listed 3 here, and I'll come back to a few others at the end of the talk. In my view, so I'm an economist that works on policy, and I try to understand how policymakers think and how they operate. I think one of the biggest long run impacts is going to be potentially that there'll just be less of an appetite and a smaller budget to invest in subsidizing renewables or passing regulations that incentivize renewables in other ways. And that will obviously have very long run impacts because that'll reduce investment, and changes in investments have long run impacts. The other thing is during the pandemic, we had the first instance ever of which the 1 month near future for oil had a negative price. So the pandemic has also put downward pressure on oil prices, and that's going to slow the investment in electric vehicles or other electric-based technologies for transportation, and that will have long-run impacts as well. So those are the bad, potential bad outcomes. The one potential good outcome is that this may have changed how we think about our work-life balance and where we work. So I've done some other work that I won't show here that has shown that those areas that drive to work, and especially when they commute to work on public transit, have had higher death rates from COVID-19. So those two facts might change just how we get to work or where we work, and that can have long-run impacts as well. So let me just talk a little bit about the short run, and then talk about what we do in the long run and wrap up. So our short run estimates are really all about calculating what we think would have happened absent the pandemic. And we use econometric models that I glossed over because nobody wants to see that at this time of day, any time of day really. So, but what we think would have happened absent the pandemic is the gray bar, and the width of the bar is sort of our confidence in that estimate. So you can see our gray bar tracks what actually happened, which is to the left of the red line, pretty well, and then projects forward after the pandemic. So this is gasoline consumption, and I think everybody sort of knows the direction that this has gone, but gasoline consumption tanked after the pandemic. It's gone up somewhat. It hasn't reached the gray bar yet, but so we're still getting some short run reductions in greenhouse gas emissions associated with gasoline consumption. Electricity consumption didn't fall nearly as much as gasoline consumption, but did fall in a sizable and statistically significant way. We've continued to track this since this paper, and electricity consumption has effectively come back to what we would have expected it absent the pandemic. And that one makes more sense because although we didn't go to work, we worked from home, or we did things at home. So we were using less electricity for industrial and commercial purposes, but more in residential purposes. We split it up by what types of power plants reduced their supply. So natural gas generation was a sizable reduction. Oops, I'm going up. There we go. Coal generation didn't drop as much as natural gas generation, and that if you follow electricity markets is not surprising because coal generation tends to be what's called inframarginal, the really cheap baseload stuff. So it's going to be second in line to fall. Natural gas, residential and commercial natural gas consumption for heating also fell by about the same amount as electricity. Industrial use of natural gas fell by more as industrial facilities were shut down. So the end result of all this, and I didn't show the jet fuel, but jet fuel tanked as well. The end result of all this is the left panel tells you the reduction in percentage terms of what those uses did during the pandemic. So jet fuel consumption fell by nearly 50%, gasoline consumption by about 37%, and so on and so forth. The end result of this is a 22% decline in US CO2 emissions due to the pandemic. And again, that's the short run impact. So that's sort of the base of which we can ask that question I posed, which is how easy is it for the long run, any long run increases to overcome that 22% decline. The other thing that I didn't show, which is also operating in the background, is that there's a recession now. So that recession is going to put downward pressure on greenhouse gas emissions. So that's going to be more of a medium term effect. So in the short and medium term, at least from a climate change perspective, we've seen reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So the long run, let me just show you some of these back of the envelope calculations and I'll wrap up. There's a few more channels that I didn't get into. So the other thing that's changed is because of the supply chain disruptions, that might have long-term consequences on where we supply upstream products. I know the transportation sector is thinking hard about that. Lower investments in renewables, not just from a policy perspective, but maybe commercial and industrial and residential customers will have fewer or smaller budgets to invest in renewables. That will have a long-term impact. What we know about renewables is that there's significant what's called learning by doing. So the more we invest today, the cheaper they get tomorrow. So that increases the size of these long-run impacts. It increases the size of a short-run disruption in investment can have in the long run. And so that's another thing to think about. And then there might just be less R&D, especially in transportation because of all the cheap oil prices, less R&D in alternative propulsion technologies. So all of those topics I actually think are going to be interesting academic studies in the future. For now, what we're going to do is like I said, a fairly simple calculation. So what we're going to think about is what would happen if the pandemic just delayed investment, delayed the investment in renewables on the electricity side and delayed investment in fuel economy on the transportation side. And we play around with different degrees of delay. I'm going to show you results of what would happen if we delayed investment for 5 years because of this on the trajectory of emissions. I'll say 5 years is a convenient number because you can also sort of think about our results as what would happen if in November the election goes in one direction and one of the candidates, the incumbent, wins and just chooses to delay investment for his next term as well. So I think either way you think about it, these calculations are useful. So here's the trajectory of emissions, and you can't see this, but I believe this goes out to 2035. So the gray line is emissions, projected emissions from the Department of Energy. The yellow and black lines are different assumptions about how quickly we respond to this recession. And you can see the near-term impacts of the pandemic because of both the recession and the empirical results I just showed you are for current emissions or actual emissions to be below the gray line. So that's the short-run reduction. But then you can see they're quickly above the gray line for a longer period. And that's the long-run increase due to the pandemic for emissions. That's on the electricity side. Transportation looks like this. So again, you see the short-run impacts of the recession and driving less, but very quickly that rebounds and we're above the gray line after that. So at the end of the day, if you go all the way out to 2035, what we estimate is that 5-year delay in investment actually leads to a 5% increase in aggregate emissions over that time period. Is that big or small? 5% often comes across as being small, but remember, we want to be moving in the opposite direction. So our sort of ideal counterfactual is not an increase at all, but a reduction. So from my point of view, any reduction is a big number. And we also split this into other pollutants, local pollutants, nitrogen oxide emissions, sulfur dioxide emissions, particulate matter, and VOCs. And there is a row here where you see the impact on total deaths due to an increase in those emissions, as well as the increase in climate change. So tragically, what we're showing is that the pandemic is going to have long-term implications on life as well, operating through pollution. Economists are often, the science is referred to as a dismal science. Unfortunately, this talk is somewhat in line with that. We don't have great things to say other than, what we can say is that policymakers really need to keep their eye on the ball here. And although there's going to be pressure to use budgets in other ways, potentially they can find investments that not only help with healthcare and reducing the impacts of the direct impacts of the pandemic, but also have synergies with reducing greenhouse gas emissions and local pollution. So we're working, my center and I are working with policymakers to think about what those investments might actually be, sort of dual impact investments. And I think that's going to be even more important. And I'll underscore the importance of the next election as well. So that's all I had to say. I'll pause there and stop sharing my screen.
Thanks so much for your presentation. We look forward to discussing it a bit more at the end when we go to questions. I'm going to introduce the second speaker now. Our second speaker will be Anam Zeb, who is going to be speaking on the implications of COVID-19 on combating climate change. Anam is a climate change activist and practitioner holding a Master's of Science in Sustainable Natural Resource Management degree. In 2017, The Ecologist named her as one of the world's rising young climate activists, and she's the founder and one of the main organizers of the Climate March 2019 in Islamabad, as well as marches in over 30 other cities in Pakistan. So you can now have the floor, and we look forward to hearing what you have to present.
Thank you so much, Lucky, and I hope you can hear me. Okay,
yes.
Great.
Great.
So thank you, Christopher, also for your presentation. I think I don't really have a formal presentation, and my points are probably going to be a lot more arbitrary compared to your presentation, but we'll have a shot. Just to start off with, speaking about climate change and environment, I find that the terms are constantly being used interchangeably, and that sometimes can be a bit of a problem. And the reason that that is a problem is because the mechanisms for dealing with both are very different, and the way they're defined are very different. So for example, when we're talking about air pollution, we're not necessarily talking about emissions at the same time. Maybe when I get into my points a little bit more, that'll be clearer. But they're very different from each other, and their implications are very different, and the mechanisms to address them are very different as well, although linked. To start off with, let's just note that the frequency and intensity of zoonotic diseases such as COVID is likely to increase as a result of environment and climate change. Climate change in the sense that warming or global heating is basically going to cause a lot of species migration. There are also going to be atmospheres that make it ripe for such bacteria and such viruses to thrive and cause further diseases. Of course, I'm not an expert in this, but based on the literature, there has been a warning that the frequency of zoonotic diseases as humans encroach onto ecosystems where we were not previously present will be causing probably an increase in the frequency of zoonotic diseases. So the term that we are constantly hearing about, the new normal, zoonotic diseases might be a part of this new normal as well. And that's something climate change and environmental changes, whereas deforestation, encroachment upon previously forested land or previously protected areas as a result of an increasing population and environmental degradation could lead to a lot more, invasive species, etc. So that's one point that we like to point out. The second thing is air pollution. Now, this is very interesting because air pollution is already being highlighted, especially in a lot of developing countries. So you'll notice that in a lot of South Asian countries, Delhi, for example, and Karachi, almost constantly are the top 10 most polluted cities in the world in terms of air pollution, and as well as other pollution, but right now for our purpose, air pollution. 1 in 10 deaths already globally is attributed to air pollution related causes. And it's one of the fifth leading risk factors for mortality worldwide. So ambient air pollution is contributing to around 5 million deaths globally if we're talking numbers. Here's where the problem lies. If you are already living in an environment that has an air pollution problem, you're also going to be much more susceptible to contracting coronavirus. This is something that a lot of research, the research has not yet been probably verified because it's still, the COVID is still, a relatively new instance. However, the current information suggests that this might be the case, that respiratory systems are already very compromised among people. And therefore, the people whose respiratory systems are already compromised will probably be more susceptible to contracting the virus. We also know, like how we're seeing in the news, that in the United States, the situation with the current wildfires and the forest fires could also be increasing people's vulnerability to contracting the virus. On the plus side, everyone using social media and everyone on the internet, in the early days of the virus, everyone was really hyping up how the water is blue again, the skies are blue again, all of this. It's because of the lockdowns, which 89 countries, I think, implemented lockdowns from April onwards, and that was almost half of the world's population. People took heart from the drop in air pollution, and the reduction in economic activity overall is estimated to have taken us back to emission levels last seen in 2006. So it took us back effectively 14 years in terms of the emissions that were currently out there. However, that seemed to have been just a very immediate response. I know Christopher's presentation went into a lot of detail over it, but some of the data that I was able to access, which is the concentrations of CO2 in the Earth's atmosphere from Mauna Loa, was basically that immediately, yes, the emissions did drop as a result of the pause in economic activity. So in Mauna Loa, the average CO2 emissions for August in 2019 was 409.95 parts per million. But in August 2020, there hasn't been much of a reduction. It has gone, it's actually seen a bit of an increase. Maybe the rate of increase is not as high as it should have been, but as it could have been, but it's still an increase. But again, like I said, air pollution and emissions are two different things. Emissions are actually, what corporations would like you to believe is that you as an individual are responsible for emissions, but you're not. This is something that climate activists, I think, are trying to drill in, that almost 70% of the world's emissions in total are coming from 100 companies. So, if we are being made to believe that by staying home or by, not going to work and working from home and, reducing our consumptions, that there has been much of a change in global emissions, that's not true. It's the 100 companies that are responsible for 70% of the emissions who have to make the changes to make climate change go away, to make the emission levels go down. Individual changes, while helpful and while individual changes will benefit the environment, they're not really that likely to impact the climate. At the same time, we have also seen that there has been an opportunity to change the way things will happen post-pandemic. So, for example, a lot of companies are going for a bailout, and they have been already given bailouts from their governments or from the global economy. So there's a $123 billion bailout to airlines, for example. Um, but the unfortunate thing is that this was a prime opportunity to attach conditions to the airlines to reduce their carbon emissions because of this, as a condition for accessing the bailout. But unfortunately, that hasn't really been the case. Instead, we see the onus coming on to consumers again, where, the consumer is then charged an additional price, for using a greener airline or for taking a greener flight. And again, the burden is constantly being shifted onto the individual and the consumer rather than the company. And as climate activists, we feel very strongly that if this issue is going to be addressed, it's very important that at this stage, conditions need to be attached to these bailouts to make it to accelerate the green transition. The IEA did estimate that energy demand contracted by 6% and energy emissions will probably decrease by 8% for 2020. There's also reductions in oil demand and coal demand, etc., crude oil. It's interesting to note that for one of the first times in the recent history, the reductions in energy consumption have been more demand-led than supply-led. But at the same time, the message that is being given out is that, it is possible to live differently. An alternate way of living is possible. But really the push and the need has to come from the richer countries, and it has to come from companies, businesses, large corporates. Individuals can't really push it, and the companies and all are going to only do it if policies, etc., push for them to do so. At the same time, in terms of renewables, we also saw that the investment in renewables has increased as well. And one of the few things that we also would like to highlight as Climate Action Pakistan is that climate change, that CO2 emissions actually can persist in the environment for up to 200 years. So if you and I, or all of the companies of the world, were at this point to completely stop our climate emissions anyway, our carbon equivalent emissions anyway, we would probably still be committed to global warming, because climate change molecules or CO2 molecules persist in the atmosphere for up to 200 years. So even if our emissions right now all over the world went down to zero, we would still be at risk of climate change at least up until 2050 minimum. So, the push actually, not to be a doomsday activist, but the push really has to be towards making the change now. And the coronavirus stall in economic activity is actually a really, really big opportunity to kickstart the process. And then finally, one of the concerns that is environmental actually is that there has been a really big rise in single-use plastics, and single-use plastics are also very closely linked to the oil and petroleum industries. And of course, there's personal protective equipment. There's all of these, things that are helping us protect ourselves from the virus. And we're being encouraged to use single-use plastics, single-use masks, single-use. And Pakistan as a country, for example, has really taken this up and is really producing a lot of Tyvek suits and is exporting them as well as of today. And there is a demand and there's a need for these at the moment, but we also have to consider that the rise in these single-use plastics will pose an environmental problem, especially in countries that have poor solid waste management to begin with. And then finally, this is kind of a very interesting point that I came across, was that we also observed a really big influence of food waste, especially in the beginning of the pandemic. So not only did that highlight a lot of inequities and inequalities, because in the global south, we were complaining about people having less access to food and there being an impact on people's food security. But at the same time, we saw large scale dumping of food produce because of a shift in demand due to the closure of economic activity. So we saw a lot of dumping, and some estimates also say that this dumping could have impacts on methane emissions, which as we all know, I think have 4 times the efficacy as CO2 emissions, but I'm going to have to double check that. So in short, I think I'm just going to wrap up by saying that yes, the coronavirus immediate gains due to the pause in economic activity, they were very visible, but the blue skies don't necessarily mean that, it's going to be a long-term impact. We're already seeing that emissions are going back to what they were before. The change has been negligible, and we really need to control this issue because these problems existed before the pandemic and they're likely to exist after the pandemic. However, on a positive note, there is an opportunity for us to change due to the pause in economic activity. It's just up to the policymakers to be intelligent about how they do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Anand. Now we will have our final speaker today, Ms. Rasu Manandar. Rasu is an environmentalist and professional fellow from Katman, Dune, and Paul. Rasu is also an alumni of the Professional Fellows Program from spring 2019. Rasu, you can begin.
Thank you, Julian. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone across the globe. As we all know that we have been affected by COVID-19 pandemic, and we fear of our own health, our loved ones, and the most vulnerables. In the span of few months, COVID-19 suddenly has become more urgent than the crisis of ongoing climate change. COVID-19 has delivered unusual environmental benefits such as cleaner air, low carbon emission, and respite for wildlife. Now the big question is whether we can capitalize this moment. We must ensure that lessons are learned, and this crisis provides a watershed moment for sustainable environment. However, 2020 has become a decisive year for global climate action. As the current pandemic increase is difficult to achieve the political momentum, it has hit the tourism and the tourism sector and the remittance sector in Nepal. Like there has been low oil prices, so that the cleaner energy has been hit harder to compete with the dirty oils. Emission could rise post-COVID to get the economy back and running. And the global recession might slow down the transition of rapid decarbonization that requires strong economic system and research investments. As we all know, like economic and environment performance must go hand in hand. And study has also showed that GDP rise and emission are positively related. Even though like Nepal just contributes like 0.027% of GHG emission globally, but it is our moral right that we contribute to reduce emission, as we are the member of Kyoto Protocol and Paris Agreement, and we are focusing on like the prevention of the melting of the Himalayas as the global temperature is rising, and Nepal has been needs to commit to 1.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise. Nepal is also revising the national determined contribution, which is like the Paris Agreement requires each country to prepare a nationally determined contribution, where the effort is made by each country to reduce national emission and adapt to the climate change, so that by 2050, zero emission, we will meet the net zero emission, and climate resilience is formed. COVID-19 has affected lives and in the sectors of climate change, in the programs of climate change, mitigation, adaptation, like in the supply of food chain has been interrupted. In Nepal, globally also, like there has been a decrease in economic growth. In Nepal, we assume to have 7% economic growth this year, but we absorbed 2 to 3% of economic growth due to the COVID-19. According to a study carried out by World Bank in Nepal, due to this COVID-19, it is estimated that 10 million people, additional 10 million Nepalese people are pulled into the poverty, and because there's reduction in the foreign remittance by 22% and in the tourism sector by 30%. As well as the COVID has also affected in the sense that the federal and local resources, due to the COVID-19, the federal and the local resources may pull the climate change issues and increase the risk in climate change related investments as well. On the way forward, to cope with the post-COVID-19, we must build back greener. For that, we must focus on the plans and implementation of programs related to biodiversity, cleaner energy, promotion of nature-based solutions like tourism, promote cleaner energy, reduce the use of petroleums and coals. The demand for sustainable options is certainly in the rise, and people are also willing to pay more for the sustainable offerings. There is room for future further encourage and support sustainable consumer behaviors. We can capture opportunity from convert waste to energy. And there has been a study if we convert the waste collected from the municipalities and from the animals, then we can replace 25% of LPG gas that is imported to Nepal by converting the wastes of the country to energy sector. And the restoration of food, developing resilient, sustainable infrastructures, and move towards cleaner energy mechanism for sustainable development. While developing a green economy, the focus should be on increasing and mainstreaming nature-based solutions on national governments, climate action, climate policy, and also the country's nationally determined contributions. And also the green economy should be focused on enhancing regional and international cooperation in ways that encourage ambition, transparency, and environment integrity. And it should also be focused on generating the shifts needed in both regional and international governance and finance to value nature and realize the potential of nature-based solution. And we should also focus on scaling up nature-based solution for mitigation and resilience and adaptation and ensuring people's livelihoods in the face of climate threats. The COVID-19 has done some unusual environmental benefits, but if we do not capitalize the moment now and think and ensure that the lessons are learned now, I think there will be more emissions and there will be more effect in the environment. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have several questions, so we'll go ahead and get started on those at this point. So our first question, and any of the speakers can feel free to jump in and take a stab at this one. What human behavior changes undertaken in response to COVID-19 have had the most significant impact on the state of climate change?
I'm happy to take a stab at that if the others want to go second or third. So, as my graph showed, the pandemic really shut down a lot of economic activity, especially on the commuting side. So the biggest behavioral changes that have occurred is the reduction in how much we're driving and how much we're flying. And that does have significant impacts on world CO2 emissions.
Yes, can I take that?
Mhm.
I agree with Christopher. Like the highest emission is from the transport sector. So I think due to the lockdown, like since all the mobility has been reduced, so yes, the highest emission is from the transport sector.
Thank you. Our next question is how or what does the international response to COVID-19 teach us about combating climate change?
I'll take that one. So in terms of the international response, it was really unfortunate that the 26th Conference of Parties this year has been delayed or postponed up until next year. And this was arguably going to be an important COP. I mean, each one of them is important, but this one was going to be relevant because they were going to iron out some of the finer details. At the same time, what we have seen is rightfully so, the COVID kind of overshadowed maybe climate negotiations or the climate processes that were taking place. Of course, it's a global pandemic and it takes priority because it's an immediate threat to human lives. But like I said earlier, we can see this as an opportunity because number one, not only does it demonstrate that cohesive and coherent action is possible, to address an issue. It's also showing us, I mean, in many ways, it's showing that yes, the impact of the pandemic is very tangible. So you can see this person has been infected by the virus, and this person, is going to be ill as a result of the virus, and in some cases, people lose their lives as a result of this virus. So the reason that governments and the international community were so pushed into taking action is because the results are very tangible. Unfortunately, with climate change, perhaps people have not been taking it as seriously to date because it's not been as tangible. You can't really see the impact. It's a much slower killer than a pandemic, for example. At the same time, there's also a lot of power dynamics at play. So the least powerful people in the world, so the poorest and the most vulnerable people living in some of the most vulnerable communities are the ones that are facing the most impact. And arguably, as the power dynamics and the power scales in the world go, they have the least influence on changing policies around this. But like we said earlier, this does provide opportunities, and we are hoping that the international community is going to be much more receptive. One of the examples that we've seen is that there has been a little bit of a shift, especially in Europe, towards renewables during the COVID pandemic. So if there is a larger push towards technology, there is a lot of potential, to address climate change, even while the COVID pandemic overshadows it to a large extent.
Yeah, I had a couple comments coming at it in somewhat of a different way. So one thing to think of, and Anam just said this, but one way to think about the pandemic is that it's almost like climate change on steroids. Like everything just moves in days instead of years or decades. So, the one potential positive out of this is that what it's done is it's taught us about externalities. So at its heart, climate change is what economists call an externality. I do something and it impacts someone else. And we're seeing that with the pandemic as well. The whole debate, at least there's a debate in the United States, not a debate everywhere else, but the debate about wearing a mask, right? You mostly wear a mask to help other people, right? It does provide some safety for you, but it's mostly about blocking your droplets for other people. So it has sort of shined a light on the importance of externalities and the importance of policymakers to sometimes have to legislate how we respond to those externalities. And it also potentially has shined a light on the importance of science, right? So both of those might teach us something about climate change. It might open the eyes of some people who were reluctant to respond to climate change, but now that they've seen it in such a fast forward way, maybe they'll change the way they think about policy and policymakers.
Great, thank you guys so much for answering that question. We do have a question from the audience. So right now, as I'm sure many people know, the American West and large parts of Brazil are facing intense fires. So do you have any thoughts about the fires and how the future impacts of climate, human health, and the relationship to COVID-19 looks?
I actually just want to quickly add, I find this very interesting because I've lived in Pakistan my whole life, never been to the US, but we've been recently working and hearing a lot about climate migration. And Pakistan and South Asia in general is one of the most fastest urbanizing areas in the world, and climate change is a key driver of that, evidently, because agricultural outputs are changing as a result of climate change and people are moving to cities. For the first time, I've actually started seeing that climate migration in the US is probably becoming more common, or it is likely to become more common, probably as a result of the wildfires. So yeah, that was just a very interesting comment for me, is because there's a very direct link between these wildfires and climate change, and then seeing that it might have an impact on migration for a lot of people. That could be something very interesting for people like us from South Asia to actually observe. But I'll let someone else take the question. I'm not very well informed about the technicalities of the wildfire.
I'm happy to jump in here. So it's certainly the case that the wildfires in California are partially due to climate change, or at least exacerbated by climate change. Wildfires are, it may not be the only cause, but what it is that it augments or increases the impacts of other mistakes with sort of forest management. So it's definitely partially caused by climate change and exacerbated by climate change. We should expect it to continue. So we might see migration out of California, or at least the areas that are most prone to wildfires. The question was also wanted to think about the link with COVID. There has been some research, although it's not completely nailed down, that local pollution exacerbates or makes COVID more harmful. So that is a potential short-term link. And, it's not terribly controversial to believe that if I'm breathing in a lot of polluted air, a disease that attacks my lungs might be worse. So there is that fear as well, that the whole Western US will be more susceptible to COVID because of this.
For our next question, for any of the speakers, has there been any noticeable effect on how people see the relationship between climate change and human health?
There is an effect, like in the air pollution sector. We have been using masks before for the air pollution thing. Now, like, they have been using masks for the COVID-19. Yeah. Interesting. Oh, hello.
So we have another question from the audience discussing water scarcity. So right now, there are healthcare facilities that are lacking basic water services. So what are your thoughts on water scarcity and its impact on infectious diseases such as COVID-19?
can I take this? Here in Nepal, we have like water scarcity, and in rural areas we have to go travel miles to get to take the water. So I think it is related. Like it will affect the water scarcity will affect the infectious disease like COVID, because if there is scarcity of water, like first thing uh, uh, we need water to clean ourselves, and if there is scarcity of water, we will not be able to get the hygiene. And since if there is a scarcity of water, like we have to travel miles to get the water, they'll be infecting more people's on the way.
Can I add to that, Rasu, if you're done? Okay, great. Just wanted to add that, of course, the push, I mean, the very basic idea that I'm going to share right now is that there's this push for improved hygiene and water and sanitation, especially in Pakistan and South Asian countries where this was already a problem, where there's already a lack of access to basic water and sanitation hygiene facilities. This is seen throughout most developing countries. We find that, now that there's a push to wash your hands for 20 seconds, to have, to wash your hands with soap, etc. So of course it might be driving better behavioral change, but we also have to consider the fact that there might not be water available to be washing your hands all the time. And in some cases, the water might even be more polluted and might be adding to the problem. And especially right now, Pakistan is facing torrential rainfall and is facing floods as a result of this. So just as an example, the incidence of diarrhea and waterborne diseases always increases manifold in Pakistan whenever these floods occur, which are happening with much more frequency now. But my point right now that I'm trying to make in terms of water scarcity is that a lot of the times it's not so much water scarcity as it is really poorly managed water and really bad policy. So in the case of my country, for example, between 94 to 96% of water is used in agriculture, and of that water, about 70% of it is wasted. And then you have people, especially those living in marginalized communities, who have to pay for their access to water. But then, and very expensive, they have to pay probably 5 or 6 times what a richer person living in an urban center with piped water would pay for the same amount of water. So this is essentially not so much a scarcity issue as it is a management issue. And perhaps COVID is the push that will push governments into, addressing this issue as an issue of equality and an issue of, equity rather than an issue of, wash, as they like to compartmentalize it in development sector terms. So, we really have to consider water to be more of a public good than we do right now.
Thank you guys for your answers on that question. At this point, we wanted to open up the question section to the audience. So if anybody in the audience has a question they would like to ask, you can feel free to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask that.
Okay, well, if we have no questions from the audience, do any of the speakers have any closing thoughts that they just want to add before we move on with the closing?
Hello?
Oh, hello?
Hello, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I have a question. Ms. Anamzeb has highlighted the issue which we have in South Asia, especially in Pakistan. So I hail from the northern part of my country, Pakistan, Swat Valley, and I am an environmental specialist. She has explained that deforestation is the cause of, climate change. But I want to add that deforestation may be the cause of, you can say, climate change, but at the same time, industrialization is the main cause of climate change, because in my province we had 17% forest cover, but recently according to Sparko and IUCN and WWF survey, there is increase of 5% increase in forest cover, and still we are having, the effects of pandemic and climate change. So there can be, there can be a little share of deforestation in climate change, and it caused pandemic, but the major contributor is industrialization, like steel company, or something like that. So I want, thank you.
Yeah, let me just say that we don't typically think of a cause of climate change. So all of the above is anything that puts CO2 emissions into the atmosphere or keeps CO2 emissions from getting into the atmosphere, or taking CO2 emissions out. So deforestation is a cause because as you cut down those trees, they no longer take the CO2 out of the air. And also if you burn the trees, then they release the CO2 in the air. But yeah, if you were to look at the share of the impact of climate change, industrialization would be, I'm sure, the largest. But I think I don't think we should think of it as either or. I think what we should think of it as there are ways that we could reduce climate change, and look for the most efficient ways to do that. That might be slowing down deforestation or reforesting areas. It's certainly reducing emissions from industrial uses, from transportation, from electricity. So it's sort of an all of the above strategy.
Thank you, Christopher. Any final comments? Well, then everyone, today was a great session. Thank you all for your contributions to this panel. We appreciate the opportunity to connect with so many of you from around the world, so thank you again for participating. This webinar was produced by World Learning in collaboration with the Digital Communication Network. We will send out a follow-up email with the link of today's webinar, as well as a survey, and also a link to join our alumni Facebook group. If anyone has questions or you want to propose a future webinar topic, please feel free to reach out to a member of our team or submit your comments on that survey. Until then, thank you and goodbye, everyone. Hope you have a good rest of your day or a good evening.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay, bye. Thank you all. Thank you for the nice presentations. We learned a lot. It was my first, webinar, but I learned a lot, and I will try my best to, improve myself and contribute to, towards the largest goal. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining.
Much obliged.